Come on, please, we can do better. Come on. It's always such a pleasure to see you, and I want to ask you if you ever had a chance to meet Dali. I know you traveled a lot, and have you ever had a chance to encounter
I'm afraid no, but perhaps it's a good thing. I do believe that part of my, Elvis, an awful lot of nonsense is talked about acting. And I'm quoting one of my heroes, Tilda Swinton, who said there's an awful lot of crap talked about acting. So let me, in addressing your good presence and our lovely audience, attempt some definitions, if I may.
Please.
And I do believe that part of my task as a storyteller involves empathy and transformation. And because I was robbed of the privilege of meeting Salvador Dali himself, I have to leap into a perception of something that is limited by my own perception and my own taste. An actor can only be as good as what he or she perceives of the world, and therefore one has one's limits. To inhabit that genius was daunting. I think I made this decision a few years ago, Elvis, that when I was, I think we talked many years ago, when I was a little closer to my years in the theatre, and looking back, and I address myself to this audience in particular, I think as a theatre actor, I was a landscape painter. And now, as a cinema actor, I'm a portrait artist. And it helps me keep myself distanced and respectful of my character. I could never be Dali, but I would have a very good shot at creating a portrait of Dali. Therefore, as I was working, it was as if the dear man was in my studio, and I had the paintbrushes, and I had the canvas, and I was tasked with creating my portrait of him. So there is now an empathy, but a transformation from my end of the atelier, painter studio, actor's imagination, to the character I'm portraying. And I love the word portray because that's what it is.
Yes, it's portraiture. But so often, we've talked about this before, you've essayed a number of figures who are presentational. And Dali himself was, I think in some ways, doing persona, and even as he painted. And we're talking about what of him as persona you found, because we get to see him present himself. And so often one of the things I really like about what you do, you take us backstage with characters. And you did that here. So talk about the presentation aspect of him that you warmed to. Because I can see there's a glint as he's preparing himself in your eye.
Mm-hmm. The showman, certainly. But I was offered a role of a great pianist, a great Russian pianist, and Horowitz. The film never came to fruition for many reasons, but I do remember that Vladimir Horowitz used to say to his impresarios before a concert, "I have to warn you," he said, "I take terrible risks." And if I were, this is between you and me, but if I were to criticize myself, I would say that I am perhaps over-careful as an actor. And you cannot be over-careful creating a portrait of Dali, because he took enormous risks. And I attempted to say to my director, Mary, I have to warn you, but I'm going to have to take terrible risks. So that I found, because I was able to portray the dear man, that I found was his gift to me, because he was saying, take risks. You cannot be careful. And I don't think we can truly, look, I'm a craftsman. On a very good day for 5 minutes or 2 minutes or 2 seconds, I might be an artist. But basically I'm a craftsman. But as a craftsman and a storyteller and possibly an artist on a good day, I have to take risks. I cannot offer you something careful, because that will never be contagious. It doesn't give the audience an opportunity to empathize or recognize. If I'm careful, it means I'm hoarding it. And if I'm careless in the right way or risk-taking, it means I allow myself to be vulnerable while telling this story, vulnerable to you, trusting that you'll help me, in a sense. I think a great deal about trapeze artists. And here's another analogy. I'm trying to talk about acting without talking about acting, but you'll have a trapeze artist who's hanging onto a trapeze and swinging in the air. That's interesting. He's careful. Then 1, 2, 3. Whoa! There's a triple somersault in the air. That's reckless and dangerous and risk-taking. And then the trapeze artist catches the other trapeze. And it's that spinning in the middle that I must offer to the audience. I cannot offer, look at me, isn't this wonderful? I'm swinging on the trapeze. Not particularly, no. But to let go. Great phrase. To let go. And then spin. And then catch. It's the spinning, it's the letting go. It's the controlled recklessness, if that's acceptable to you.
No, but we've talked so often about you preparing yourself physically for these people. And you talked about vulnerability. There are a couple of times I saw it. It's really great to see on the big screen. The moment where Gala goes off with Jeff or Jesus, and there's that look in his eye that we can see the entirety of the relationship and what he wants it to be and what it is not. And the moment he says, I want all these assets. And that's a moment of inspiration, but it's 2 moments where we sort of feel that letting go you're talking about, that lack of control. I want you to talk about those, David.
Well, I think there it is a process of empathy, of understanding that having made himself so utterly dependent on another, by definition, he's going to be utterly vulnerable to that person. Fortunately, when I was at school, I counterintuitively studied physics, chemistry, and biology because I wanted to follow in my father's footsteps, who was a physician. It wasn't a considered decision. It was blind. It was to please. It was for all the wrong reasons. However, my schooling to a pretty good level in physics, chemistry, and biology left me with a forensic approach to acting. Cause and effect, laws of physics. So part of my cause and effect equation for dear Salvador Dali was if you hand over every aspect of your life to another, then you are making yourself incredibly dependent to and vulnerable to that other. She, in a sense, I'm trying very hard not to judge Dali or any of the characters in the film, but there was a part of that dependent relationship was more, he drove her into being his mother, which she must have resented. and therefore trying to equate not how do I act jealousy or vulnerability, but is it not utterly logical that he would feel that? And then it just percolates through my performance. It's almost subconscious. If I can grasp my character, if I can comprehend my portrait and why I'm painting it or why I'm creating it, then another metaphor for acting, but certain brushstrokes will be automatic. Certain choices of colour will be automatic. I hardly look at the palette and I hardly look at the canvas.
But it takes us back to portrait, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And portraiture. And these moments I'm talking about, what you just said, took me back to the scene near the end, where he's watching the younger Dali not drop her to her death. And that's the awful moment, because if he drops her, he loses. But if he holds on to her, he loses too, doesn't he?
But also, John gave me that wonderful line. I was very tempted to throw her off, which I think is a wonderful line, and he must have been, because that level of dependency is a nightmare. Because you live in constant terror of getting it wrong, if you see what I mean. So there's the recklessness on one side, and there's the care and the vulnerability on the other. His paintings are not reckless. The technique is extraordinary. The minutiae, the detail of his work, technically and as a colorist, brilliant.
It's what you're talking about, though. It's that intersection between craft and abandon is in the work, isn't it?
It's a very, very fine balance indeed. Sometimes it can go off kilter, and sometimes if you are keeping, and an actor can only be as good as the company the actor keeps. If you're keeping great company, either in the rehearsal room or on the film set, then somebody can just correct the balance. A good director will just correct, if they have the material with which to work, just tilt that, the great bar, another metaphor, sorry, the great bar that the tightrope walker has walking across the tightrope, then just tilt it a little bit.
But if we're going to trade artistic metaphors here, that takes you back to your days as a musician, where it's that thing too, where craft and practice leads to inspiration. Mm-hmm. And I felt like in some ways that fueled this perception that this empathy you're talking about for Dali.
My incarnation as a musician?
Yeah, because it's about those things we're talking about.
Well, yes, indeed, but I'm immensely flattered because I can't read music, but I have a very good ear. And in my early days, I very nearly had my own little band. In fact, I did for a little while, and I used to record songs to be broadcast on the radio. I think there's one recording of me, I think, recorded at the National Theatre, but it's not my music, I think it was Harrison Birtwistle's music. But I wrote the songs for a production of As You Like It. I wrote the songs for a production of The Tempest, where I played Ariel, and I wrote the music for Bertolt Brecht's Bach, in which I played Bach.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Wow, because I haven't asked you about your first conversation with Mary, because she's a number of times made movies about that intersection between art, commerce, and sexuality. And what was your conversation about with her, the first conversation about doing that?
Well, fortunately, Mary was able to stay for 2 or 3 nights in our home in Oxfordshire, and we had a lovely, relaxed, but very informative time. And I recall that the main thrust of my conversation and my quest towards my portrait of Dali was something that seemed to remain plastic throughout all of his life, a plasticity, a malleability, a soft clay, something that never hardened or matured. So we spoke a lot about the child within him that didn't grow up, because why? Why grow up? I'm sure Dali would say that. Why? There is the eternal immature in him, which is shared by, as you know, other great geniuses who came before him, Mozart, Picasso, others who came before him. Something in them never quite hardened into a shape or a form or a gesture that would become them for the rest of their lives. He died as Dali. He didn't die well, bless him, but he died as Dali. He died as Dali. He died still with that plasticity and possibility, and so yeah. Mary and I spoke of the child that never grew up, and I think it's also that might have been rooted possibly in the loss of his brother, and that early death as a child. And he did speak a lot about death, and it is included in the film Mortality. So there's mortality, and there's that plasticity, that fluidity that never quite hardened as well. And that is what Mary and I spoke of.
Because that gets to the relationship too with Kamala. Part of her is to keep that plasticity alive, to sort of keep that bubble around him, so he can still be malleable and open to experience.
Yes, indeed. And it is the I suppose it's almost the opposite of a love story, in that it's an autopsy of a marriage.
I was going to ask you if that was a love story or not, because it feels like that in his moments of weakness. It feels like not just dependency, but love. When she takes his hand and she's talking to him. And so much of that relationship is whispered.
Yes.
And so much of that relationship is stuff we don't hear as a viewer. And I wanted to ask you about that. It's so intimate, it's like they're speaking their own language to each other.
I'm sure that they were, and I'm sure that those intimate gestures, they were the kind of thread that sustained their marriage that many others in the world were not witness to. Again, a fine balance. There is a wonderful story by Albert Camus. It's mentioned in this wonderful collection of essays, The Myth of Sisyphus, where at home, this man's wife had the habit at home of cutting up the meat on his plate, and then he could eat it. She did it in a restaurant. He divorced her the next day.
But that's the difference between here and there, where this relationship, but still there's a public aspect of it and a private aspect of it.
Yes.
And again, going back to one of these things I really treasure about your work, the performative aspect that these characters let us see so often. I think about The House of Sand and Fog. I think about Sexy Beast, where these are people who had an image that they wanted people to see of them. And I wondered if Dali, if that part of that was one of these things you responded to. That he had this thing that he wanted to see, that he erected around himself, but still he had himself open to experience. I mean, that's a big amount to put on your plate, if I can torture a metaphor myself.
It is indeed. I was, of course, aware of his need to present himself. Also, I was aware, very interesting, there were photographers on the set, and there was also a photographer that came on the very last day of shooting to visit me and to photograph me. He was Viscount Moore, British aristocrat, and a very celebrated photographer who had photographed Dali in the 1960s. And he came to Liverpool on the very last day of filming to photograph myself. It is the one that's used on the poster. And he was pretty overwhelmed to see me and meet me. I have never been more, with all respect to Mary and the movie camera, I was so committed to my portrait for that gentleman. I so didn't want to disappoint him. The photograph is marvelous. There's an another photograph of me. But it's me saying, look at me, I'm Dali, awful photograph. Awful. Because my ego got in the way, completely got in the way. Whereas for dear Derry Moore, the photographer, I presented Dali's ego and not mine. But as soon as my ego got in the way of that presentational aspect, like, oh, I would present myself like, well, you're not Dali. You would present yourself like that. You're 10 out of 100 points that Dali would make in presenting himself. You're 1/10 down the lane, down the road, to that kind of presentation that he could offer to the world. Getting into a taxi cab, I've seen a film of him getting into a taxi cab, kneeling on the sidewalk and blessing the driver before he gets into the cab, with total confidence. That kind of presentation I admired for its audacity, for its risk-taking, and it's the risk-taking that gave me, please, the courage to leap from one trapeze to the other. You have got to take the risks that Dali takes. If you cannot play Salvador Dali as a tame actor, if you're tame as an actor. The actor has to Peter Brook told me this. I loved Peter so much. We lost him a couple of years ago, well into his 90s. His voice is still in my head. I have had, ladies and gentlemen, the most beautiful galaxy of voices in my head who have guided me on my journey, to whom I will be eternally grateful. And Peter said, always when you're portraying a character, find something in that character that is greater than that aspect of yourself. And I remember I was playing Demetrius in his famous Midsummer Night's Dream. And Peter Brook, during one rehearsal, said to me, Ben, what do you think of Demetrius? And I said, well, Peter, I think he's rather silly. You must find something in him that is greater than yourself. And so I slept on it, it percolated, I read the beautiful script again, the Shakespeare play again, and I said to myself, would I follow a lover into a really dangerous, haunted forest, knowing that lover could be condemned to death by marrying the wrong person? No, I wouldn't have the guts. I wouldn't have the guts. I realized that Dimitri is not a silly boy, he's extremely courageous, led by his heart in a way that makes the drama beautiful, makes Midsummer Night's Dream beautiful. So I served that and served the production, and he elevated everybody's performance, even Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream, you know, the weaver who turns into a donkey. The most magnificent, beautiful finale of that man's journey in the play. Moving. He usually gets belly laughs. You know, so moving, so touching.
Ladies and gentlemen, a man who always leaves something greater than himself on the screen, serving Kingsley.